So in this video, like I said, I kind of want to finish out the Moten and Harney series when it comes to the workers' strike. I think that this has been a really interesting opportunity to talk about the various ways that Moten and Harney shows up on the resolution and the ways that teams may contest or think about the arguments that they're making, and also the ways that they can forward those arguments a lot better. And hopefully it's been a really good series for you. I want to end this last video by kind of continuing the conversation we had in the last one, where we were talking about what are the best ways to answer affirmatives that will read Moten and Harney on the workers' strike resolution. And that's definitely where I kind of want to end this discussion. I think that it's really interesting to have the discussion here, because I think that a lot of the conversation that we had so far from the last video was definitely a lot based on just like what your general priorities should be and what you should be thinking about when you debate these affirmatives, how you lock them down to specific advocacies, and the way that changes the way that you'll do things like the framework and T-debate. And so I definitely think that if this is your first time really getting tuned into the series, it would definitely be helpful for you to not tune in the last video and to at least go watch the video I did just before this, or the intro to Moten and Harney and workers' strike if this is your first time kind of getting into this part of the resolution, because I definitely think it's something that will show up on the workers' strike resolution is something to worry about. And so in this video, I kind of want to just talk a little bit about what it looks like to execute critiques, counterplans, and disads versus a Moten and Harney affirmative, and what that kind of looks like in order to like build a cohesive strategy that is kind of like able to move beyond some of the more generic like arguments that people are kind of stuck on in terms of thinking about Moten purely only in the terms of the academy. Because I definitely think when people take and read Moten arguments outside of the context of the academy, it becomes a lot harder for teams to really consistently answer these arguments. And I think it's really important to get good practice being able to kind of identify how you want to resolve these questions and like what you should kind of be doing in order to create an advantageous debate for yourself. So when we kind of like start this discussion and we think about this in the context of the criticism, I definitely think that there are a lot of the levels of the criticism that need to be really sound in order to have a really strong critique of the Moten and Harney question when they're affirmative on this resolution. I think the first thing is that you really need to figure out the basis for how you're able to evaluate like the efficacy of like movement making. I feel like a thing that I think a lot of teams can really catch Moten and Harney teams on in terms of their kind of like relation, it can kind of catch a lot of Moten and Harney teams on in terms of the framing debate, is really trying to figure out what it means to be able to analyze the tactics of the 1AC. I feel like Moten and Harney affirmatives, like I've said, and kind of some other times where I've talked about these types of arguments, really thrive off their ability to kind of be like all encapsulating of a bunch of like social movements and social tactics that are outside of like institutionality and outside of vertical movement organizing, which makes it really hard for criticisms that really don't want to take that route to really staticize offense and make it possible to win, that the way in which they want to like think about tactic organization is both separate from the affirmative and not the same as kind of like linking itself to the type of individualism and other things that the affirmative is kind of like impact turning from the base from the beginning of the debate. And so I definitely think that when you're reading a criticism, it's really important to figure out what is the basis that you want to contest the affirmative on. I feel like a place where I see a lot of criticisms doing a really good job that I feel like Moten and Harney could be weak on is being able to win that it really is a question of how we are able to analyze and think through and study the resolution at a theoretical level. I actually think that it would be really interesting to see a critique kind of take them on like how do we think of a theory of power as like incredibly important to how we think about what types of tactics that we organize, and then basically being able to take up that the kind of like stance that Moten and Harney have towards the world, that they have towards these kind of like institutions and structures, and their refusal to kind of take up a more like not even just pessimistic lens, but a lens that kind of like refuses the possibility of like rekindling things like social atmosphere and kind of like social connections in the current world that we live in, is a really interesting place to kind of take up these affirmatives on, because I definitely think that the way these kind of affirmatives thrive is being able to win that like all of the kind of like criticisms that were normally read think the same thing about why the state should be refused, and that kind of means that they're all kind of moving towards the same place. But I definitely think on the framing debate, if you kind of take a moment to be like, this is not how we should stake this debate, and it should be a question of how we theorize and think of struggle before we're able to create tactics in relationship to struggle and build a really strong net benefit debate off of that, then I think you have a really strong way to kind of start contesting the affirmative. I think it also lowers the threshold for what your alternative needs to do, because I feel like this is kind of where you are able to justify like things more like refusal alternatives and things that don't have to actually justify like other tactics that are competitive with the affirmative, so that you can kind of sidestep that strong question coming from the affirmative. Because I think that in a world where you are taking up on the tactics, I think the debate gets just really messy around the permutation debate. And I feel like if you really make it a debate about how we understand competing theories of power and how we understand competing structural theories, then it gives you an argument about why the way in which you're just performing or doing negative debating in the first place is kind of an example of like what your differential study looks looks like and why you should refuse the 1AC. And I think it makes it so that your alternative development feels much more mutually exclusive with the affirmative than when it does normatively. And I also think it gives you a better basis in order to build link arguments off of, because now you have link arguments to why their kind of like method, not only is their theory of power kind of bad as kind of your base source of offense, but why their method as connected to their theory of power can only produce the same kind of bad things that you're critiquing because of the ways in which it requires a kind of like over focus on the way in which we think about like social and material tactics before we're able to think about like where those tactics are being geared toward, where their energy is being put towards. And I definitely think that that's an interesting basis to contest for the criticism and set yourself up for a much more interesting alternative debate that gets you a lot farther. I think that when you kind of like take this advice to the counterplan and disad debate, I definitely think that my advice swings a little bit more opposite on this end, because I think that in the counterplan and disad debates, especially for the worker strike resolution, you have a lot of material to really just take them up on material instantiation of like what their method looks like, and you're able to make arguments about like why the kind of like material interactions that their affirmative is able to have is not only stopped by things like questions of crackdown, etc., but are actively not able to make the same material gains that people are able to make via a kind of like legalized worker strike. I think that it would be really interesting in the counterplan disad debate for you to kind of like be able to mix arguments between like why at a global kind of like modeling level it's good for us to be able to set precedents about like the ability for resistance to be something that is like latent within the right to exist, the right to be human, etc., but also why it's important to understand that regardless of whether or not you're able to win the kind of like global spillover arguments, there are a bunch of kind of proximate impacts that are created by the inability for us to create a system in which like the worker strike is able to happen reliably, and the kind of affirmatives like destruction or the affirmatives refusal to allow for a state legitimization of that also allows for the continued warfare from the state onto these types of unions, and also allows for private enterprises to continue to dissuade their workers from being able to come together and unionize. And I feel like there's so much good offense to be made about why that kind of like strategy ultimately creates the continuation of material instances that not only individualizes but make it harder for us to think about how we can create agency and resistance in other places that are not necessarily included under the title of worker. And I think the more you're able to make like maybe a counterplan argument that's able to spill over into how your net benefits will be able to access these other forms of organization, that you have a way in which the counterplan is able to consume and solve most of the portions of the affirmative, but they don't have a reason in which they're able to solve back some of the more proximate causes and impacts that are created by the state's continued delegitimization of workers' movements and their refusal to stand in alignment with them. Hopefully this video is helpful for you, and hopefully you'll keep tuning into other videos that I'll be doing in general, because I really had a good time doing this particular series. And yeah, thanks.